Hello and welcome to the season finale of Synthesized Sunsets. Today we are here with friend of the pod, Merrick, as
Hello.
well as friend of the pod, Raj. And
Hey.
we are here to talk about progressive fantasy and other general works of speculative fiction, and in particular, Brandon Sanderson's Stormlight Archive. Because I have not read the Stormlight Archive, I wanted to let you all try to sell me on the Stormlight Archive or not. So anyone who wants to go first can go right ahead.
I can go first, I guess. So I read like pretty much all the Stormlight Archive books in like January of this year, 2025, which is a bit rushed. So I kind of binged through them. First off, The Way of Kings, the first book in the series, I thought was just like great, all around fantasy, kind of everything you want from fantasy, and specifically just like the world building throughout the whole series is just like really cool. Something will come up a bunch of times, then you'll learn something deeper about it later, and it'll be like, whoa, that was really cool. I thought the plot within The Way of Kings was pretty cool and stuff, but then I think it kind of lost its way over time. In particular, I thought the next book, Words of Radiance, was way worse than the first one, which I think is not really a common take, or at least that it's just like not very good. But yeah, I guess my largest criticism with the series is I think the characters are too dynamic. And this is kind of a weird criticism because normally characters are criticized for being like static and, not really changing. But particularly, a character will go through a character arc, and they do this in Way of Kings. And in Way of Kings, it's worked because it hasn't done this again. And then they just go through the same exact character arc, like they get kind of like knocked down for no reason, and then go through the same exact character arc again, and then get knocked down for no reason, and then go through the same exact character arc again. It feels fine the first time, but once you achieve that, like once, or maybe you could get knocked down once or something, but like again and again, it starts feeling like, at this point, like I just expect you to be good at life. Like, why are you tweaking, bro? And any thoughts, Raj or Merrick?
I don't agree with the second book being mid. I think your take is pretty high, especially because I think some of the like most epic scenes in the series happen in the second book. Like the duel scene
The
is
duel.
like one of the best sequences in the
That was
series, in
excellent.
my opinion.
I mean, I agree. That is fair. I also think Adolin's just like the best character.
The only good arc over like the entire series.
Yeah. I mean, Dalinar is very good too, I think. But the main reason I like Adolin is he doesn't have this erratic behavior for like the sake of character growth and stuff. He's kind of just a good dude throughout.
He's a genuinely good person.
Yeah, I agree.
Over and like pretty consistently over the books as well. But like still shows growth and acts as a counterbalance to all of like the two dynamicness that you described earlier.
All the characters have some sort of trauma going on, like the main characters, Kaladin, Shallan, Dalinar, and it makes their character arcs compelling and makes their characters very fun to read about. But again, as you said, it's super repetitive, especially as the books go on and on and on. They're extremely long books as well. It feels like you're retreading the same arc over and over again, which is why Aelin is such a nice contrast.
So Raj,
Yeah.
what's this book about anyway?
Yeah, that's maybe a good point to start with.
I actually don't know what this book is about.
What you start with is this one man being captured in a slave wagon, and you follow his story for a bit. It's extremely dramatic. The setting is amazing. The character interactions are awesome. He makes friends with a bunch of people. He breaks them out. Dramatic things happen.
Maybe it's good to introduce in terms of who like the three characters are in the first book. So Raj already mentioned Kaladin, who's like the guy in the slave wagon. And then there's Shallan, who is like a young woman trying to attain wardship under a famous scholar. And then the last main character, I would say, is Dalinar, who is the king's uncle, currently leading a war for the Alethi on the Shattered Plains, which is just like the location that the war is occurring.
The plot of the book is basically started by this king gets assassinated by these people called like the Parshendi, and it like starts a war. Kaladin is a slave. His role in this war is like running these bridges carried on the backs of slaves to go between these, because like this Shattered Plains landmass is kind of like literally imagine plains which have just been like shattered sort of, so they have all these chasms and stuff that have to be crossed with bridges. Shallan is sort of attempting to become the ward of this like powerful person who's the daughter of the king, like the princess, basically. And she's like a top philosopher historian. One thing that's sort of interesting, and I think is like why The Way of Kings is better than the other books in the series. I feel like Sanderson really tried to cook with the gender roles and stuff. He tried to have like balanced gender roles, I feel like was his goal. He's like, I'm going to have like very strict regimented gender roles, but they're going to be like, you know, well balanced for like having power in society and stuff. They're like somewhat based on like historical gender roles. Men basically do the fighting and the ruling to some extent, but they are illiterate, and women are the only people who are religiously allowed to read. And as a result, get like a lot of power from that. They're the only people who do science, history, philosophy, any of that stuff. And also any communications between men have to be mediated through women. So there can be a lot of like power in the background there as well. And I thought that was an interesting dynamic. Sanderson was cooking when he was making this stuff for the society, but then it just like really falls by the way drop as the books go on. I think Sanderson is like too afraid to have like, you know, it's like, well, like this is a good person in my world because I'm having them as one of the main characters, so I'm not going to have them be like prejudiced in any way. It just feels kind of unrealistic, like given the world.
Wait, I kind of disagree. I actually think that there's like a lot of prejudice that's portrayed. However, I agree that a lot of them are like way too open to changing their ways. Like all of the people who are like very staunch in their upholding of the current norms are like side characters, basically, or just make comments about being very staunch in their beliefs.
Yeah.
All the main characters do initially like grapple with like some change, but then very quickly are like, oh, actually, it's correct to do this.
Yeah.
I compare it to, have you guys watched Sex Education?
Yeah.
At all? I like felt like some of it was just like sex education where they are just very clearly being like, this is what is correct, and we are going to use therapy talk now to explain the things that are happening very explicitly.
Are you guys surprised by how popular the Stormlight Archive has become? Or do you think it's pretty obvious why that is upon reading the series?
I think it's pretty obvious in the sense that it's extremely easy to read for someone who hasn't read much before. The prose is very simplistic in a way, but also very evocative and emotional, especially in the first book for me. The events that happen are extremely dramatic and told really well, despite the level of the prose being relatively simplistic compared to more traditional fantasy authors like Robert Jordan or George R. R. Martin, for example. It's very easy to read. I guess the equivalent today would be like Sarah J. Maas in romance. It's very easy to pick up the book and dive into it, even for someone who's not that much into reading.
Yeah, I think he strikes a really good balance between having like such a compelling world with being very easy to access and like honestly like very strong storytelling. Like I know that we've been criticizing him a lot, but I think that like in general like his plot lines are very strong. He does a really good job leaving Easter eggs for later books in previous books or even other books. I know Gordon hasn't read any of his other stuff, but he has like things that are relevant for other series.
Yeah, I mean, I can kind of tell, like, sometimes I'm like, oh yeah, this has got to be connected.
So I think that that is like a big draw as well. Anything that you read of his will have relevance to any other thing that you read of his.
I think that's true, but it also in my head it's gone too far in that direction and gone to like something like Marvel syndrome where everything feels connected. The people who are really into it get all the little bits of lore, and everyone else is like, okay, what's this character doing here? It's like, why they're important, why they're relevant, why is there so much screen time on this person? And also the plotting and the stories were very interesting in the first book. They're very narrow plot lines. There's just a couple of them you had to focus on. As the stories got bigger, I felt like the world became a bit more sprawling and the stories started losing their emotional impact. That's my main criticism, I guess.
I will say, I think that the Stormlight Archive doesn't suffer this as much as Mistborn, the second arc, or the second set of books. I think the second set of Mistborn books really suffers of the collective mythology that's happening, especially the last book. It's like way too much Cosmere, which is like the Sanderson universe. A rebuttal that I've seen online is also that if you're reading Sanderson, that's like the reason why you're reading it. But I think that the end of the second Mistborn series, I think it was too much. I think Stormlight is still like very comprehensible and self-contained.
I believe that there is a Mistborn movie that's in development.
No way.
But Brandon Sanderson has specifically said that while he said that his books would probably be better as TV shows, he kind of doubts TV shows' ability to actually have an impact on mass culture. and wants to adapt these things into movies instead, just because of the fact that streaming is so fragmented. Whereas, like, if a movie's in theaters, it's like, okay, at least everyone knows that this movie is coming out at this time. And he's also said that Mistborn is the only series of his that he actually thinks has movie potential. So I was wondering what you guys thought of those various statements, and whether you guys think that the Cosmere is destined to have a Marvel universe-like fate.
I think Mistborn would be good as a series of movies, actually. Like, the plot's relatively small, it's self-contained. I think it would work quite well. Though, honestly, what I want to see is an animated series, or even an animated movie would be really dramatic.
You mean like getting the Arcane treatment or something?
Oh, yeah, something like that. Yeah, for sure.
Oh, okay.
I haven't read Mistborn, but Stormlight Archive books feel kind of awkward as movies. I think you could do Way of Kings. I think you could just literally make Shallan not a character. Even though I think her arc is good and stuff, it doesn't really fit with the rest of the story in the first book. And as a result, I think like for a movie, you could just completely axe that, and then it's like reasonably self-contained. But even there, it's like still pretty much two completely separate arcs.
I could see it as like a two-parter of the two storylines that are not Shallan. Because Shallan is like pretty much irrelevant for the first book. The biggest criticism I could say in the first book is that like Shallan is like totally not relevant.
Yeah,
Like-
I feel like that was the only book where I actually liked her plotline, though.
her plotline is like her own story and very interesting, but I think she's in like maybe like 15% of the book or something.
Interesting.
It's probably more than that. I'm probably being
Yeah,
dramatic.
I think it's more than that, but it's just literally never interacts with
Yeah.
a character.
It's like very hard to tell whether like how she's going to become relevant.
Her storyline is the least interesting to me. Like, I think perhaps because she wasn't a main character in book one, I just every time there's a chapter of hers in the next books, I was like, oh, why am I going through this? And then,
Well,
like,
this is my biggest criticism of book two. I think her storyline in book two was like terrible. Like actually just like really bad. Like I skipped part of it because I was like, oh my god. Tin, I think that was her name, right? Like the con artist person who sort of starts teaching her like con artisty ways. I think she was like the worst character in literally the whole series. And I thought they did not build up what's it wait, why am I forgetting the name? What's like the secret society, whatever that she joins?
oh yeah.
Oh yeah. Yeah, I do not think like they set up the Ghost Bloods well. I thought the Ghost Bloods were like reasonably cool by the end, but when they were first set up, to me, it was just like, why should we care? This is kind of like small fry shit. Why are you bothering infiltrating this?
Back to the series though, I think that Stormlight would be very good as like a Game of Thrones type series. And I think that it's
Yeah.
unreasonable for Sanderson to want to make mass impact on media in a film or TV format. Like I just don't think that that's reasonable for most filmmakers.
I kind of agree with Sanderson though. Like I think that obviously there are exceptions, but I think it's comparatively much more difficult to make like a big impact with a TV show because audiences are so fragmented, especially because most TV shows have a really big drop off after the first season if there's any sort of reasonable gap between those seasons. You know, people just like forget about it and drop off. That could be really frustrating. I feel like it's just way more common than not to be like, oh, this show, and then the person you're talking to is like, I don't know this show. Whereas with the movie, just because it's like capped by the number of movies that can be out in theaters at one time, I think if you like mention a movie, there's a much higher chance someone will at least like have heard of it. So I think in that way, he's right. Honestly, I wonder if people would be better served by there being like less shows.
I know that Sanderson has spoke about this before of being like film and TV are basically facing the same issue as books did, where it's just like the market is so saturated that it's very hard to get individual audiences' attention. But like books are still fine. Like people still read books. It's not like books disappeared. So we're just gonna see like a shift in strategies in how shows and TV market themselves.
Yeah.
And like they haven't quite figured that out yet, but that like it will probably be fine. Just
But I think
because
the big difference is that TV shows and stuff take way more resources to make and like way more personnel. And so if you're making a TV show, it's like using resources at the expense of all the other TV shows that could be made or like could be made better. I watched this pretty depressing video about Invincible where they were talking about how, like the extremely tiny number of animators that are like on the show animating as fast as they could, and they would still have like multi-year breaks in between seasons. Every year you take is just like more audience that you bleed out, and they're kind of like in this impossible situation Whereas like if they had more animators and resources at their disposal, they could just like make the show better with not like a ton of downside. Or they could just stop paying their freaking voice actors so much. But you know.
Was it Invincible where they actually found that they'd subcontracted some stuff to North Korean animators? I remember there being some controversy about this. They accidentally got like sanctioned or something.
That feels plausible. I saw like this video where someone re-edited some of Invincible 3 and 3 to like add lighting. There was an actual animator on the show who posted the comment and he was like, yeah, we like were trying to go for something like this. We just like ran out of time. You did a good job. Sorry, our bad. I was like, damn. Do you guys remember that scene in Invincible where did you watch season 2 of Invincible?
Pretty sure
I did not.
There's like this part in Invincible where they like talk about the shortcuts that the animators take in animation while they're like doing those things. Because like he goes to a Comic Con and he talks to like this showrunner that he really likes. And it's like, oh yeah, you know, it's really hard to make an animated show. Like sometimes we just gotta cut corners. And he's like, sometimes we just have to like show the back of people's heads when they're talking, like while it's showing the back of the head while he's talking. It's like pretty funny.
Or like, and sometimes we'll have a really wide shot where you don't have to move the people because I have seen that scene, but that's the only scene that I've seen.
Is this in story?
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. It's just like in the middle of an episode. You're like, oh damn. Invincible
hilarious.
animators are fed up.
Kevin, have you heard of Sanderlanche before?
Heard of what?
The Sanderlanche.
No.
Basically, at the end of a book, he has this extremely long fight scene or like climactic action scene. It hits you like an avalanche, so they call it the Sanderlanche. It just keeps going on and on for page after page, and it's a page turner. You can't stop reading. It's just intense action. It's extremely fun.
Mm-hmm. I'd assume that it'd be sort of akin to some parts of The Wandering Inn, which we've kind of been dancing around for a while. Merrick, have you read The Wandering Inn at all?
No. Well, I read part of like the first volume, but like not that much of it.
Okay.
In no way close to being caught up.
Yeah.
Have we talked about The Wandering Inn on this podcast, Gordon?
I think we've mentioned it. But Wandering Inn is, I think, the longest piece of English literature in existence. Potentially, not 100% on that.
Probably not
but...
anymore after AI, but yeah.
Okay, I mean, but yeah, it's this web serial that's been coming out since 2017, I think 2016. It takes place in another world. A bunch of people from Earth get transported there, and that's kind of like the main driving event to the story. And the main character is like, you know, a girl from Earth who appears in this other world.
I think what makes The Wandering Inn compelling is that it borrows heavily from a lot of things that are less accessible for various reasons and then mashes them together into something that is pretty accessible considering how long it is. For example, I would say that The Wandering Inn is probably most heavily influenced by like the isekai genre of light novel and anime, which is like in Japan, this popular genre where someone gets transported to another world. This genre is usually kind of shit on because usually it just takes the form of some male power fantasy where the main character is just like becomes the main character of the universe by virtue of their position in the story, and they kind of just like get this weird harem of women. There's a lot of pandering to the audience in these sorts of shows often that many like general audiences would find distasteful. But despite literally being an isekai, The Wandering Inn doesn't really feel like an isekai at all. And I think part of that is its scope. Like you never really feel like the main characters are like the main characters in the universe. I mean, I guess there's times in later volumes where it almost gets to that point, but it never even gets close to like isekai levels, you know? And then there's also just like a lack of pandering to that audience that is refreshing. But then another thing that it draws from is I think it does a good job of making these very developed fantasy tropes accessible. Like there's like a lot of stuff that would be very familiar to like players of Dungeons and Dragons, for example. There's like classes, different races that have their roots in classic fantasy. But I think that the author packages it in a way that is like a very satisfying blend of low fantasy and high fantasy. And they even sprinkle in a little bit of like cultural commentary that, at least for me, was a big part of why I kept reading. There is this one particular scene where there's a character who has an iPhone. It doesn't have any charge because there's no chargers in this universe, obviously. But then there's this court magician who figures out how to cast a spell to make the iPhone start working again. And then everyone is just like entranced because they're just like, oh, wow, this iPhone. And it's like actually an iPhone. You know, it's not like some kind of generic fantasified version of an iPhone. It's literally an iPhone. They show it to the king, and the king decides to play Flappy Bird, actual Flappy Bird. He starts playing it. And then he gets so mad playing Flappy Bird that he accidentally like smashes his fingers to the screen because he's so strong. And then it creates this massive panic because this is the only iPhone in the entire kingdom. They're just like scrambling to get it fixed, or if even that's possible. And like studying the circuitry, they have no way to replicate any of this. They just have to pray that their magic works. And there's a lot of moments like that where it just intersects with popular culture in like an interesting way. I think that helps it avoid feeling too like dusty and insular, and like it maintains all of the hallmarks of these genres that are like really entertaining in some ways, but doesn't really cater to those audiences specifically. And I think that's what makes it so successful.
Yeah, it's excellent. It's very easy to get into for a modern audience who isn't really necessarily familiar with a lot of these tropes. I think one thing you didn't mention but you alluded to is that it's also in the genre of a lit RPG, a literary RPG, a role-playing game. The kind of the same mechanics that happen in role-playing games, like you have individual characters with levels and classes and skills. These are all mechanics of the world itself. It's like a role-playing game but done literarily, so it's a lit RPG, which is a very expanding genre right now, as in there's a lot of people writing in it. Most of the work is not particularly great, but The Wandering Inn is one of the few examples that I've really enjoyed.
It's able to just like use its length as an advantage and also to be like multiple genres at once. I would say The Wandering Inn is epic fantasy and slice of life. And you normally can't do this with like a book or a show or something. But if you imagine it's just like some epic fantasy story, but you actually see every day of the person's existence rather than just like skipping to all the epic parts, like you kind of get both of these at once. In general, I just like length in things. A book being longer will be likely to increase my enjoyment of it just because I'll feel stronger about the characters and whatnot. And I think it does this really well as well.
One thing I really liked about The Wandering Inn, especially in the beginning, is that there's always, because of what you mentioned, a sense that the storm is coming. You read it, and it's like there's these very chill hangouts that are happening at the inn, which is the central focal point in the novel, but things can just like turn like so quickly. Like it's just like a normal day, and then suddenly like some insane thing happens, and there's just like a couple times where like there isn't even like any reason that some like horrible cataclysm has to happen, but then suddenly it's just like goes into epic fantasy mode in like one chapter. And I think that The Wandering is really good at this, and it's like it has like a big payoff. I think my favorite parts of the story were not epic moments that were actually built up, but epic moments that kind of just like happened and you just weren't expecting them, but you're like, wow, why is this like suddenly super epic?
The face-eating moths.
Yeah, I didn't even think of the moths. Yeah, the fucking face-eating moth. It sort of feels like a lesser version of the George R.R. Martin thing. Like, there's no reason why main characters have to be protected from death. Like, there's no reason why the story has to follow this predictable narrative flow, you know? Like, because it's so long, it can afford to just, like, take these dramatic shifts. Not for any particular reason, just because that's what happens when you live in a chaotic world with magic.
Yeah, that's excellent. The constraints of traditional publishing that you have to have, books that fit in a particular size and they have to have narrative structure. The lack of that structure allows for much more interesting storytelling, I think. I really enjoyed that part of it. Also, you mentioned the dramatic flips in like slice of life versus things. And I've heard it described as, oh, The Wandering Inn is a slice of life novel with a touch of war crimes, which is
Yeah, body horror.
Yeah.
Oh, and I would say that the world building in The Wandering Inn is probably the best I've ever read, in the sense that the scope of it is insane. It spans multiple continents, all with 100 different factions. Maybe I guess the best I can compare it to is something like Warhammer 40K. Maybe that matches the scope. But apart from that, it's absolutely the biggest world that feels most lived in that I've read.
Mm-hmm. Another thing that I like about The Wandering Inn is that because it's serialized, the author very much does try to expand parts of the story that the audience seems to be interested in and shrink ones that people are not. Like, you can definitely tell that certain characters were meant to play a bigger role and certain characters were meant to be a smaller role, but they kind of like expand and contract based on what people are saying about the story. There are certain arcs that just didn't really seem like they were going to be that big at the beginning that suddenly become huge. And I think that's always pretty satisfying to see. You're just like, yeah, democracy at work. I think that's like the good form of serialization. I think the bad form of serialization is like the more extreme version of what you guys are saying about Sanderson, where like the author just churns out the same thing over and over because they found out the formula that works for them. But I think the good side is the fact that you can have it just be this like responsive work that's like in conversation with its readers. And that's really cool. Another thing that's really cool about The Wandering Inn is in terms of audience choice, a lot of web series will have something like, okay, if you're a patron, you can vote on what you want to happen or like what story you would like to see. Now, I think the interesting thing about The Wandering Inn is that when they do these polls, every option they mention still happens in the story. It's just a question of like how much of it are you going to see or like how soon you're going to see it. There's all these things that happen, and not only do you get to see the one that feels most interesting to the audience, but also it just feels very, very plausible that there was also this other thing that happened and like there was an equal amount of lore. You just didn't see it. It feels very convincing that all of these things are happening in the world, and I think that definitely contributes to it.
Well, while we're on the topic of The Wandering Inn, so both me and Kevin stopped reading The Wandering Inn like a while ago, and so I guess I'll bring up what I think was kind of happening to it. And I think it sort of has to do with what you were saying, Raj, with the world feeling so big. I think the main issue was they started to make the world feel too small. It started being a thing with like all the scrying orbs basically being like the TV. I think this was like really bad for the book. It'll be like some event happens, and then just like the majority of the chapter is these 12 most powerful people on different continents react to blah blah blah. And it feels like you're watching this like YouTube video, and it's like, oh, it's King Fetad. It's just like, okay, we could just like stay in the moment here. That started kind of happening with everything, and like everyone knew each other kind of, despite really feeling like they shouldn't. It also made the protagonist start to feel like more like an actual main character of the world, because they start having like connections to everyone on all these different continents and stuff. Where in like the early going, everything is like really separate from each other.
I would also say that it suffered from a bit of J.J. Abrams syndrome. There's a lot of climactic events that are built up for literal millions of words. They're just like not going to hit at that point, but I think some of them especially just felt really anticlimactic and disappointing, or just like you've kind of stopped caring. You're just like, oh, okay, I guess these people met. Like, yeah. Also, The Wandering Inn has this interesting thing going on where like there's the quality of the story, but there's also like how good you forecast the rest of it to be, I guess. There's definitely this period of time, especially towards the end of volume 4 and volume 5, where it's just like consistently getting way, way better. And you're just like, oh my gosh, like how good is this gonna get? Honestly, volume 6 was probably my favorite volume. But despite having said that, I think volume 5 is just really special in that it just feels like there's so much potential. Whereas like in volume 6, the potential sort of levels off a bit. It doesn't seem like
I would agree.
as hype. Volume 6 and volume 7 I enjoyed a lot, probably more than volume 5, but I think you can really start to see the cracks show. Whereas volume 5 is like almost perfect in terms of like how it just expands and blows up into this bigger story. Do you feel like reading is getting more popular?
Objectively, no, I think, in the sense that I saw some studies on how much reading people are doing in the US, and it's been dropping precipitously by like some crazy amount since the pandemic. But also, then again, I've heard that reading has been taking off online recently. There are all these
It's like a trend now. Is what is from my impression. Is it's like there's TikTok book trends, and a lot of it is smut, from what I can tell.
If it gets people into reading, whatever, I guess.
Like a lot of people are into reading like these really awful smut situations where it's like a bean or something.
Wait, a bean?
Yeah, or like I think that I saw somebody sent me one that was like a spoon.
Wait, tell me more.
I don't know, like the characters are utensils.
Oh, interesting. I see. That sounds entertaining.
It's like, yeah, basically like satire smut.
You're not doing a good job at making this sound terrible, not like incredibly intriguing, Merrick.
It's supposed to be like ridiculous.
Can't wait for utensil smut to be in my search history.
Yeah, I don't know.
Kind of off track, but related. I have a friend. He's a very tall white man. I don't know how relevant that is, but he was like living in Korea for a bit, and like so went to Japan a few times, and one time went to an anime convention and like got roped in to being part of this news interview about the convention, and they were like, we'd like you to walk down this aisle of manga and like be real, like flip through some of the books and be like very interested in it for B-roll. But the aisle was like full of boy love hentai, basically.
Oh no.
And he was just like I'm not that embarrassed to just like be flipping through this, but then they had me like talking with some of the authors. They were clearly like extremely excited that I looked like very interested in their work. and I have absolutely zero interest in any of their work. But I had to like talk to them and pretend that I was like very interested in their boy love hentai. And he said that was like basically the reason why he's like not that interested in becoming very fluent in Japanese anymore. He was like, I basically lost all interest in reaching like a very high level of proficiency. I don't know how relevant that is, but I think it's a good story.
It is a good story.
It feels very Japan, unfortunately. This is sort of retreading familiar territory, but I'm very interested in how like the actual medium of text stories itself might change in the future. And something I'm particularly interested in that I think would be good for stories like The Cosmere or The Wandering Inn are like algorithmically tuned novels that specifically highlight the sections of the story that I think you as a reader might be most interested in. And I feel like that could solve a lot of the problems that people complain about with like not liking certain arcs and things. I think it would be like interesting if the algorithm could kind of penetrate down to like that level of granularity. Not only does it know what novel to read, but also like what version of the novel to show you and what parts of it to expose or highlight. And I'm wondering like if anyone is working on that.
I think it would be cool. I'm kind of wondering how this is different from like a almost like choose your own adventure type thing.
Well, you're not choosing. That's the difference. It's being chosen for you.
Well, it might be interesting to have like some sort of like feedback thing where you're just like, I like this as you're reading.
Well, yeah, I mean, the feedback is how much you like the things that you're consuming. But yeah, I would just serve you like the version of it that it thinks you would most like.
The way I'm imagining it is something like skip this particular arc. Every time this character comes up, like I don't know, just like delete them. Delete Shalon
Well,
from Stormlight Archive.
yeah, but it
Yeah.
wouldn't like delete them, right? It's just like a wholly self-contained like alternate take on the book. You know, like you have version A, you have version B, you have version C, and like version C has almost none of this character. But then,
Are you
yeah,
imagining like there's like a complete version where like all of these storylines happen?
there's no complete version. Like there might be the most popular version, but everyone kind of gets their own algorithmically tuned version of the text to the point where one person's version might just be like very
Completely.
different. Like some character that like never shows up at all. Like the person that shows up like one time, so the person is like the main character of theirs.
Or I guess, but I'm wondering like if you mean like because like in my mind, right, there would be some collection of all possible arcs, characters, and storylines that happened. Or like there would be a complete version, just nobody ever sees it.
Well, perhaps, but there's
Like-
also like different ways you could tell that story and stuff like that. But yeah, I mean, I guess there would just be like, I mean, it
I
depends
mean,
how.
you would need to have to like write out everything that people end up seeing. There does need to be some sort of like complete.
Well, not necessarily,
text.
because you could just have plot things that happen and then they like get fed into some LLM that
Yeah, you
then
could just, I feel like I was imagining you'd more like LLMify it.
yeah.
Oh, okay.
Like it might even be like procedurally generated as you read it.
I don't know how I feel about that to be
Yeah.
honest, but I think that it's a cool idea. But I
mean-
much prefer the version where there's like some Omega story where like all of them like every possible thing that you would read has been written already by a human, but like the order and which ones you receive are like different.
I think a pretty good analog is like Ender's Game versus Ender's Shadow. Like, have you read
Mm.
Ender's Game, Ender's Shadow?
Yep.
Before? There isn't like a complete version of like Ender's Game, Ender's Shadow, right? It's just like they're just like two different books. But it's like, yeah, there is like a general universe that it draws from. To me, having like a complete version, Ender's Game, Shadow, Omega, just doesn't really make a ton of sense to me.
I see what you mean. It's like a different perspective on the same story.
Yeah.
Kind of
Yeah.
an interesting thing that I've been kind of in like the like Zettelkasten digital garden space recently, but I think that would also be like a pretty similar interesting storytelling version where there's like a couple different starting points and it's just like a story web that you just kind of like move through
Yeah.
based on what things seem interesting to you. So it's like sort of like some non-linear like storytelling.
I think in some ways, a lot of these large universes with like multiple books are similar. Like think about Cosmere for example, or the Warhammer universe. I realized Warhammer has like over 50 books about the lore, and people usually just recommend a different subset depending on what kind of stuff you like. So I think that sort of gets at it, but they're not the same story viewed through different things, like different parts of the story in that universe happening. Just I don't know. I think that's fun.
I guess one thing I'm imagining in terms of how it could be commercially viable is like, you know how in anime, like most scenes are partially done with computers, but like the specific scenes need to be like really good or like hand drawn by this one master animator. I think there's some particular term for that. So like I could imagine some kind of sprawling fantasy series where it's just like specific scenes that are like the Sanderlanche thing that you're talking about, where like the author really tries to cook and like everyone has read those scenes. Then like the connective tissue is more like LLM slop stuff. Like, I feel like that could probably go pretty hard.
I personally don't like that, but mostly just because I'm against like LLMs creating a lot of stuff that we consume.
Yeah.
Even though I'm actively working with LLMs, but like I don't know. I feel like I'm not qualified to be looking at these things, and neither is anyone else. So we should just stop. I think we kind of talked about this last time I was on, where I was like, I really think that like AI generated art is like super interesting, but I kind of don't like that I like it so much. So I kind of don't like the idea of just like creating some story using only LLM.
Right now, at least, they're not great for long-term like planning stories, so I'm not worried yet. But when they do, it'll be scary.
I honestly think that the thing that Kevin is describing could be like pretty well done with an LLM.
Yeah, yeah. I feel like this is actually a good use case for it. Because like if you have like your normal version,
If the portions are short, yes, but
Like if you're just like this scene is next, and then it's like some prompt based and with like some fine tuning based on like what the preferences have been, I actually think that it could be quite good.
no, don't make it happen.
But I don't. I like. First of all, I'm too lazy.
Yeah.
Second of all, I don't know how much I like that, but I
Yeah.
think it's a very interesting idea.
how involved would you say you're in open source?
I'm a very big user of open source stuff. I think I try to avoid most proprietary software if I can. I don't contribute too much apart from like bug reports and occasional minor edits that I know will fix things. I try to contribute to documentation once in a while, but yeah, not really much writing code because I'm too busy for it right now. I like the philosophy of open source software a lot. I like the idea of humans working together to do things that work well for all of us without the expectation of financial return. I just generally like the philosophy. I have this very hot take that intellectual property rights shouldn't really necessarily be a thing. It's like artificial scarcity when I don't know. Oh, sorry, it's a whole different rant. But have you heard of enshittification?
Yes.
Okay, so Cory Doctorow is this author slash tech journalist at this point. He's been talking about the idea of enshittification, where you have a product that works really well, it blows up, it gets tons of users, and then at some point they start not making money anymore, and they need to keep delivering returns to shareholders. And so they try to extract as much value from their users as they can by making the product successfully worse and worse. At some point, the product just becomes terrible, and people are locked into that ecosystem because they've invested so much into it. It's sort of the curse of things that get too good too fast, and eventually they all end up crappy. And the idea of open source is that an open source project isn't really owned by anyone the same way. People can just fork it. So you take the last known good version and then just use the community to develop it. And so that sort of software doesn't have these problems to that extent. Different set of problems, but yeah. Open source software in a lot of cases is superior to a lot of the proprietary software that I use. In the sense that think about the last time you had like an annoying bug in some software and you couldn't contact developers about it, or like you have no idea what's happening. You go to some forum, there's a blog post at some point, and there's no resolution ever. Open source software is not like that. Like I've often talked to the actual devs who work on the software, get responses. It's very lively, it's very dynamic, and a lot of the proprietary software, the infrastructure that they use, is open source. So there's a lot of piggybacking off the goodwill of the community without necessarily contributing back, which is not very nice, I guess.
Do you think that the fraction of people who are willing to do open source stuff is going down?
I don't know. Well, the absolute number of people is increasing. People are more busy, their time is valuable, they get better opportunities elsewhere. A lot of people do these as passion projects. People do get funded for open source. Donations are a thing, but it's extremely hard. Unless your project is very famous, successful, you don't get it. There's a huge amount of maintainer burnout. I don't know if you've seen that XKCD where like the web infrastructure is like a pile of blocks.
Oh yeah,
And
the one. Yeah.
and there's one tiny little library like holding things up. And there's often been the case where maintainers just burn out and like let the library stagnate. And then you have huge security bugs that happen because of that. So the EU and governments in the UK have been doing things to sort of promote open source and the funding of open source software in the name of making all software more stable and secure. The EU right now wants to divest from a lot of US tech companies because of security concerns, privacy concerns, especially when for like government business. So they've been pivoting to homegrown alternatives, which are open source. I think that that's a direction that regulation is sort of catching up to. Yeah.
There is this phenomenon where there's maybe not the best selection bias people who like post a lot on the internet, for example, because they tend to be people who like their time is not as valuable to them, free time to do this stuff. Whereas the people who are probably making like or like more capable of maintaining this environment are just like doing their actual like important responsibilities in the world. And there's some internet writers who have written a lot about this. Like I know Tracing Woodgrains, he wrote this pretty long essay about this one guy on Wikipedia who was able to exert an immense amount of influence just because of like being ideologically committed in some way and also just like not really having shit to do, and how he could really benefit from the fact that like most of the people on Wikipedia like had shit to do. How would you say people balance that? Like, how do you mitigate bad or incompetent actors who kind of just have an outsized influence because of the disproportionate free time that they have?
Yeah, for sure. That's a good question. So I guess the long tail of projects that are open source are pretty bad quality. They're just things that people have done for their own enjoyment or fun and just put them online. People can just look at them, but they're often not going to be very useful. The projects that do get momentum and that become big, they have a lot of maintainers, lots of people looking at the code, lots of people contributing. There's this saying that when there's so many eyes on it, all bugs are shallow, or something like that in the context of Linux development. There's definitely the idea that bigger open source projects tend to be better maintained and more secure. At the same time, there have been recent scandals where malicious actors have actually like infiltrated projects and caused security bugs. So recently, I don't know if you've heard of the XZ controversy recently. It blew up in the tech space. Basically, a library that is being used by pretty much everyone and their mother. It was hijacked by a foreign actor, someone who contributed code over several years, and they got trusted and got permissions to add to the repository. And then they started adding malicious code, which is pretty obfuscated. So the idea is that only like state actors with like huge amounts of power could actually pull this off. And someone caught it because the thing that they introduced caused a delay of like some 20 milliseconds in something that they were trying to run. And they were like, why is this slower than it should be? And they went in and looked at it and they're like, actually, oh my God, we just uncovered this huge scandal. It's insane. But yeah, their open source security is like an evolving thing. It's complicated.
Why do you think that there is not better open source social media?
People are trying. Have you heard of the Fediverse?
I have.
Mastodon, Lemmy. The thing is, these social networks are driven by network effects. If none of your friends are in them, you're not going to join them. So it's definitely one of the places where it's much harder for an open source alternative to rise up because you need critical mass to shift. So Blue Sky, for example, managed to get a bunch of that critical mass. They blew up when Twitter started doing shenanigans at some point last year. Mastodon had a huge surge in users. At the same time, these have been very artificial. It's not been natural growth in some sense. It's a network effect. Twitter is valuable because that's where all the people are. It's not that they have like a particularly great product or something. Of course, sure, they have like reliability concerns and things like that, but in essence, Mastodon is equivalent. There's not really any particular feature set that Twitter's offering over Mastodon, but it's just that there are fewer people there, so it just stagnates.
I feel like I've observed a couple times where it seems like people are really this time people are going to be moving over to this alternative platform that's open source, but it just seems to fizzle. I remember when I was younger, there was this whole shit show around Ellen Pao, who is like I think the CEO of Reddit. I don't even remember what the scandal was about, but I think it was related to banning certain subreddits. And like there was this mass exodus to this open source utopian alternative called Vote, where
Okay.
users could be paid for contributing content and stuff like that. But it just like I remember as a high schooler, I was like, "Oh, this is gonna be such a big thing. So everyone's gonna be using Vote." But like, yeah, no one gives a fuck about this place anymore. I've not really observed these like open source social media platforms being particularly good at handling this sort of intake, because it seems to me that as an open source social media app, like one of the things you should be most prepared for is these sort of like black swan events where tons of people migrate into their app, because that's kind of the one chance you do have at really blowing up. But at the
Yeah.
same time, it feels like this always goes terribly. Like it feels like Blue Sky should have just observing what has happened to open source things in the past, just been really gearing up for like, okay, what do we happen when like all of these
Yeah.
people just start streaming to the site? I've like never really seen that go well.
Scaling infrastructure is really hard. I think that's a problem. Like if your server supports like 100,000 people and suddenly like 10 million people start joining your next day, like scaling it up so flexibly on very short time scales, I guess, is very difficult. Also, one particular thing about the Fediverse, Mastodon, and related things is that people host their own servers. So it's not like one big service like Reddit. It's like 1,000 individual people set up their own little instances, and they can all connect. It's sort of like email. So like you might be on Gmail, I might be on like Yahoo, someone else is on like Outlook or something, and can all communicate. It's sort of similar to that. That's the situation that this is, which is kind of nice in the sense that a lot of the concerns about the centralization of speech are removed. If someone sort of censors you for things that you want to say, move to a different instance where you're allowed, or you spin up your own instance. You can choose who you want to talk to, which has its own worries about like becoming an echo chamber, but at least it's not the kind of centralized echo chambers that we have today. And the feed is generally not algorithmic in the sense that it's not someone deciding what to show you. It's generally just like a simple timeline, which doesn't get as many eyeballs, so it can't be used for advertising revenue as well. But it's also often what people really want to see.
Do you think that the Fediverse is going to take off in the future?
I don't know. So far, it's very lively. I've seen very wholesome interactions there. It seems like Twitter before it got bad. That's how people have described it to me. I've never used Twitter, so I don't really know. It seems to be that the people who are there are invested in making it a nice place. They have nice, interesting discussions.
So do you use open source social media?
I generally don't. I try to avoid social media. I do have accounts on Lemmy, for example. If I have to contribute, I'll contribute more there than like Reddit. I had a Reddit account, and I basically don't use it anymore. I only use it because it's a very good forum. You can get answers to questions really well there.
It's like interesting how much better Reddit is now that Google has been so inshitified. Because like now Google search results are just so awful that like if you just like append Reddit to there, then like it'll be pretty good. But like it used to be that you could just Google it, but now it's just like Google search results are just abysmal.
Yeah, it's so bad.
I don't know when that started happening. Like, I feel like it was just gradual. Like, I know, like, when ChatGPT came out, I just kind of, like, immediately switched away from Google searching without thinking. But, like, thinking back, I'm just like, yeah, I guess Google search was kind of getting worse for a while. And I just kind of, like, didn't really notice until there was a big alternative to switch to.
I haven't used Google search in like 5 years, so I'm not.
Yeah, exactly, right? Like, isn't
still
that crazy?
I like used DuckDuckGo maybe like 6 months ago, and I was like, why is this just like so much better than
Yeah.
Google?
I don't have a Google account anymore, not for like the past 5 years. Or like
Also, they just spam you with this, like, Gemini crap that, like, isn't even true.
one of the things I want search engines to do is have a blacklist of sites that you don't want to see. There's a bunch of spam websites like, I don't know, learntocode.com or like
Yeah,
Code Academy. I don't want to see that. If I Google something, I want the Python docs.
W3 schools is like so bad.
I swear. It's like, it feels like a feature that everyone would want, right? I don't know why is it?
Well, because I think those sites pay to be at the top. Right?
Yeah,
So they have no incentive to block them.
Yeah.
Fucking Business Insider, man. So I think this is a pretty good time to wrap things up. As a final note, Raj and Merrick, do you have any pieces of short fiction that you would like to recommend?
Okay, I have a little short sci-fi story. It's called "They're Made Out of Meat"
Whoa!
by,
Okay,
by Terry
I'm so
Bisson.
excited about this one.
It's excellent.
That's a good one.
It's very fun. It's short and it's very entertaining.
Cool. How about you, Merrick?
I would say I was gonna say I have no mouth, but I must scream.
Good classic one, yeah. Definitely good recommendation. Great story.
All right. Well, thanks so much for coming on the pod again in Merrick's case. And we will see you all next week. Welcome back. So, Gordon, do you have any thoughts on the episode?
Yeah, first off, I think that was like maybe the most fun episode for me that we've done. I don't know how listenable it will be, but it was pretty sweet to have 4 people. Good to have Merrick back. I had kind of like read all the Stormlight Archive books recently and not really talked about them with anyone because I weirdly don't know anyone who's read them really, which feels kind of strange considering how popular they are. So it was a lot of fun to discuss that. And then conversation kind of derailed at some point. I don't know how much, if any, of the last hour or so talking about random sports and whatnot we're going to keep in. But yeah, and any thoughts for you?
I felt like I didn't have a ton to add in general, mostly because I haven't read Stormlight. There are definitely some angles that I can take, but this was definitely like a bit of a different episode for me because I was necessarily taking more of a backseat. But I think that's probably good for the dynamic of the show going into the future. And yeah, I think even with something as popular as the Stormlight Archive, we're still in this very atomized pop culture ecosystem. Stormlight is just so well liked amongst this very distinctive swath of the population. But even with that being the case, there's just so many people who've just never freaking heard of this thing. So it's not totally surprising to me that you don't know people who have read it. I've met a lot of people who have read the Stormlight Archive, but just recently today, I was like, met someone, they said they were into fantasy, and I asked them if they had read the Stormlight Archive, and they'd never heard of it. So it was a good like reality check as to like how wildly popular the Stormlight Archive actually is.
I guess that's sort of surprising because I feel like I do know a ton of people who have like heard of it, but just like haven't read of it. I think that's like pretty common.
Right, yeah, but like
considering its length and stuff.
Like you could be someone who's just really into like Harry Potter and stuff of that flavor.
No,
Or
yeah,
someone
that's
who's
fair.
really
That's
into,
fair.
like, the Court of Thrones, blah, 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 Fourth Wing, and like stuff of that flavor. And you might not really have any reason to know about Stormlight Archive, right? Because I mean, there's not really a lot of times there's not reason to know about any book.
Any,
you know,
yeah. That's really true. Like, yeah, at the end of the day, like any book is like going to be like less known than like fucking Attack on Titan or something.
Yeah. It's like realistically, I feel like most people who say that they like fantasy have probably read like 3 fantasy books in the past like couple of years or so, right?
Yeah.
And if those few are just like not Stormlight, you might, it's like it's not the last 3 books you've read.
That's sort of something I gotta remind myself of in terms of reading. Like at the end of that, like I feel like kind of fraudulent on some level saying I like fantasy, considering I have like such bad coverage overall. I feel like, and haven't really read that many actual fantasy novels. But most people, like our age especially, just really have not read that many books.
Yeah, for sure. But then also it's like really weird because the average for fantasy is probably pretty high because there's some people who just read like a fuck ton of these books. Like I feel like people are just like downing dozens and dozens of fantasy books in a way that they don't for other genres. Like it's hard for me to imagine someone devouring literary fiction in the same way, unless you're like Harold Bloom.
I do feel like I like fantasy, or even just like I like reading in general, conveys a frighteningly little amount of information. Like I don't know. Sometimes someone will just be like, I like reading, and they just like haven't read a book in 3 years. It's just like they kind of like the concept of reading, I guess, or they liked a few of the books they were assigned in high school.
I will say that one success of the publishing industry recently, I don't know how much of this is like organic versus astroturf, but reading is kind of a desirable lifestyle. Like at least
yeah.
I think there are a lot of people that just aesthetically appreciate reading and like having books, and just like they can just appreciate that independently of liking the actual activity of reading. And I don't know if you see that as like a win or not for reading, but I think it's kind of a win. Like I think that people prefer the lifestyle of reading a book aesthetically to like watching TV, even if they much prefer watching TV and like haven't really read a book recently.
Yeah, I think that's a win. I mean, it's obviously like not as good as the alternative of just like people preferring reading, I think, but
well, I guess what I'm saying is like, has the outcome of that been like?
I think the outcome is like more people reading.
Yeah, I kind of feel that way too. I kind of feel that way
for
too.
sure. Even if it's just like you're only reading to like read for the book club book you're in as like sort of a status thing that you don't really actually like to read that much, it's like you're still reading a book, maybe. It's like something.
The previous mode of enjoying books was like the book club thing, like the book club model. And I feel like the book club aesthetic of reading books is like very, very different from the book talk aesthetic of reading books.
Yeah, I think this is kind of something I've felt for like a while, which is changing now, where just like more people treat reading as entertainment rather than like an intellectual growth exercise or something. I kind of think reading should just be primarily an entertainment activity. I think that's kind of what it's meant to be.
Yeah, well, I think it's meant to be a lot of things. I feel like previously reading occupied a space that was very similar to like fitness. If you're really into like getting fit, you probably might also at least be sort of interested in reading for like similar self-improvement reasons. But now reading is sort of more akin to like photography, like appreciating nice objects and curating an aesthetic lifestyle. That's kind of an interesting shift. I don't know if you agree with this.
Yeah, I think that's sort of fair.
Maybe there's a better example than photography. I don't know. I think photography is like a decent example.
Yeah, I think that's pretty good, yeah.
Can you think of like other shifts like that? You have some old hobby that's sort of like gone from occupying like this one space in people's lives to another. For example, if we're thinking about like photography itself, I feel like part of the reason it's like weird is because photography has like also moved. Previously, photography was much more similar to like making films right?
Yeah.
Whereas like now it's just totally detached from the process of actual like analog movie making, right? Like now it's just kind of a thing that's accessible to everyone. And so like not only has reading become more like photography, but also photography has become more like photography because it used to be a different thing. Like I
Mhm.
don't think reading has become more similar to photography like 50 years ago.
Yeah, yeah. Is there cases of that sort of transition happening in reverse? Like something moving from more of like an aesthetic vibe type thing to like a serious.
Probably like movies, right?
Yeah, maybe a bit. I mean, I think people still mainly watch movies just for like the vibe.
Yeah, yeah,
But,
it's true.
but like I agree to some extent, like
Maybe it's more the case for TV because like movies are more of like a entertaining event, you know, where you get together, whereas like people mostly
mhm.
watch TV by themselves. And I feel like TV used to be more of like a I think it used to be more social and also a little bit more like mass media entertainment. But now
Yeah,
I think
yeah.
people have more pride in like the artfulness of their show selection. And it's also like less
Uh-huh.
accessible too, you know? Like there's just so much fucking TV. It's pretty hard to like get into TV in a serious way.
I was gonna say maybe like music, but nah, actually no.
Mm, yeah.
But I kind of feel like music, if you look back like a while, like definitely not. But I think music is kind of like, if you think like early 2010s and stuff, having like a music taste used to be like really important. And that became like less and less important over time and stuff.
Mhm.
But then it's like, I feel like it's becoming more important over the past 10 years or so.
Um, maybe.
I feel like there's a period there where a lot of people just like really just listened to the radio and that was kind of it.
Yeah. Yeah, I guess so. But I mean, people still had their favorite stations and stuff. Like, I feel like stations are also more differentiated.
Yeah, but I feel like they really were in like the 90s or something. Yeah, I feel like I like 2011, like
Okay,
I don't
that's
know.
yeah. I have like interesting feelings about the radio. I kind of enjoy listening to the radio, like the idea of it. You know, like I really like the idea of there being some like crate digger on deck that's just like serving you the hottest new tracks from whatever. But like I just dislike the end result so much generally that it's not worth it. But I feel like having a favorite radio station that you really like and you can talk to about with other people would just be like super cool. I kind of wish that I liked KEXP a lot in Seattle. It's like this beloved local radio station, just so I could like talk about KEXP, I guess. Like it
Huh.
feels like fun. It feels more like communal and interesting than talking about like streaming. And I remember like and I think it depends. Like I think that there isn't always a station like that, but I know like there's this very beloved DJ in the United Kingdom named Annie Mac, and she used to have this radio show that was like very curated in like an interesting way. 'Cause she was just like super into dance music and had been into dance music for decades. Kind of hard to imagine in America because America is just not really that into dance music in a serious way most of the time. But she would play like pretty interesting tracks, and then she also had this segment called like hottest record in the world or something that was like pretty hype. It was like what's gonna get selected for Annie Mac's hottest record of the world, but then I remember listening to like her last broadcast specifically, where like it was like after 40 years on the air, she was finally like ending her show. And then she was getting like kind of emotional on the air. And then she's just like, ah, yeah, I'm gonna close you guys out with like one of my favorite tracks. And it's just like this really whack, like electronic track. And I was like, ah, yeah, this is pretty hype.
Yeah.
It made me wish. It almost made me wish I could have been a long time listener just for that like emotional peak to really like. I imagine if you're like a really long time listener, like oh my god, it's this kind of weird song.
Yeah, that's pretty cool. Yeah, I definitely agree there is an allure to like following a station and whatnot. But yeah, radio, it just like feels so inferior to me as a experience than streaming. Mainly in the fact that like at this point at least I'm like so used to a continuous stream of music pretty much that I just get sort of annoyed when like I mean like ads are obviously annoying, but even if it's like no ads like SiriusXM or something and it's just like someone starts talking, I'm like why are you talking? I want music, you know?
Have you tried like
Um,
the Spotify radio DJ mode before?
yeah, I hate that shit.
Like kind of so bad.
Yeah.
It's like the whole point of that is you can feel like they're like artfully selecting tracks, but it's just like they're so obviously not. Like all the segments are just like, why did you pick this? It's just like
Yeah.
vaguely aligned in the machine learning cluster.
Yeah. I mean, I even like some of the Spotify, like, if you ever use like their day list or whatever type
Yeah, the daylist.
thing.
Yeah.
Yeah, I feel like that's like pretty good
Uh-huh.
setting. But like the DJ where it's just like the dude is like talking, that is just like no.
I have it set to like the Spanish woman because
Mhm.
like the shit that they say is always so like stupid and banal. So like at least if it's this woman talking in Spanish, I can pretend they're saying stuff that's like really smart and insightful.
Mm. That makes sense. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm glad
Yeah,
it sort of
that
makes sense.
oh, it totally makes sense because then it's like I don't know. It's better than like we're gonna do. I don't know.
Like, you've been listening to a lot of this lately. I'm like, you
Have
don't know
I?
that. What if you had a situation where like the 200 most similar users to you or something in your metropolitan area got your own radio DJ who would like go on the air every day for like an hour or something? Would that like be cool?
Oh yeah, that would be like, and that would be like goated. Yeah, that would be really good.
Okay.
Yeah.
And
So I guess I mean I'm not like that opposed to radio. That if it was just like
I feel like that's kind of more how it used to be, though. A lot less people listen to music, and also a lot less people listen to specific radio stations compared to streaming now. But well, there's like a couple things going on. Like, first of all, there's less people listening to radio stations, right? So it's a little bit more personal. But I also feel like if you're engaging with music in like a radio forward way, your taste isn't going to diverge as much because like partially streaming allows you to better handle divergences in music taste, but it also creates them. Because if you had just never been exposed to certain swaths of the music landscape, your music would probably be like a lot less different. So I think that having that would be more similar to the old way of listening to radio than you might think, assuming you were
yeah,
listening to a legitimately alternative station.
yeah, that's a good point. That would be pretty hype. But on the other hand, it's like part of what makes that feel hype to me is because like I guess like my specific music taste feels like something that is just like okay, they're like actually wouldn't have been a station for this.
Well, yeah, but I don't know if you can.
But like my specific music taste wouldn't have like existed if I like grew up in the 70s.
Well, that's what I mean. But like, I guess I'm saying like I feel like it's more realistic treating it against the counterfactual, where like somehow people are still listening to the radio now. Like, would there be a station for it? I'm a little bit more skeptical I would never gotten into music because like I feel like I'm more extreme than you in that there's just very little music period that I even liked from like the 19 just from before 2000 honestly. And
Mhm.
especially even before like 2015. And I previously operated under the assumption of like, oh, well, music now is goated because I just wouldn't have been into music if I had been listening to music back whenever that was. But thinking about it more, I feel like I probably would have had like a book talk type thing happen where I can get into lifestyle of music first and then get into the actual music just as a result of like liking some kind of counterculture or subculture. Something I've been thinking about is like, okay, well, if that's true, like based on my personality and the lifestyle that I would have wanted to live back then, could I like predict what music taste would have been in like the 1970s or something? Like, is that a legitimate exercise? And my conclusion is that I would just like have liked house music, which I guess I still like house music, but certainly like a different flavor. But I don't know. Like, do you think that would have happened for you as well?
Yeah. I mean, if I imagine myself in the 70s or something, I feel like I just would have liked rock, which would not be that surprising considering I do like rock. Yeah, I mean, I just think like I didn't really have a strong music taste at all until I was like 17 or so. And if it was like in the past, I feel like I would be much less across genres.
Yeah, but that's kind of what I'm saying is like in the radio station counterfactual, there actually might have been a radio station for like you then, which is not necessarily, although probably
Yeah.
inferior to like a radio station for the stuff you like existing now. But I mean, it's the same for me as well. My music taste would have been less interesting. I think it would probably been worse in some subjective sense, but I think that it would have been better in other ways. And I'm not really sure that I would miss I mean, I certainly wouldn't miss what I have now, but like, I don't even know if I can say for certain that it would be like significantly inferior to some like third party observer.
Yeah, I mean, I think like I think I would probably have like maybe more interest, or at least I would probably have like more to say about music. Like I would guess I would just like know way more about the process of stuff and like production and that sort of thing, and I would like collect records and stuff. I feel like there's less incentive nowadays to like have deep knowledge and more incentive to have broad.
Yeah. Actually, like it's
Uh,
really not that important.
yeah.
Because like
And-
I mean, I feel like part of it is that if you had deep knowledge in the past, you kind of like give OP recommendations. But
mhm.
now it's kind of impossible to give OP recommendations because it's not totally impossible, but like you're really gonna do better than like the Spotify algorithm. Like it used to be, right? Like you would pretty much only hear music from outside of your zone from like the radio and like seeing live shows. And that was the only sources that your friends had too. But then
Mhm.
you could just have like this random dude with like some OP record collection and show you some like really OP songs, like, oh my God. But like now if someone shows you a recommendation, even if they're just like cooking, it's probably gonna be like a bit worse than the median Spotify recommendation. And so I feel like that's kind of a bummer. So one idea that I brought up in the conversation with Raj and Merrick was this idea of I didn't exactly know what to call this, but the working title is like sakuga novels. So basically a like if you're not familiar, sakuga is a term from anime and it basically refers to the fact that most anime are not like all hand drawn by some like goated master artist or even a couple. Generally, there's some really, really good animator that does what are called the keyframes, like the most important ones, and they're like assistants or even like some kind of technologies used to fill in the gaps in between. And so this ends up being a lower quality product than if the animator were to do the whole entire thing. But of course, it also makes it way easier to mass produce, and having like an entire anime be hand drawn is completely unrealistic. And so what they do instead for most popular anime is they have a couple key scenes which are called like the sakuga scenes where you have this like master animator that actually spends a ton of time like drawing all this. And so then you get the highest quality animation for the like most important story beats, the stuff that people can really remember. And the rest of it is just kind of filled in with stuff that's like oftentimes still like pretty decent animation, but they don't really fill in all the details. It's not quite as artful. I think that this style of production is going to be pretty applicable for fantasy writing in the coming years with the advent of AI, because I don't think it is realistic for AI to be used to generate entire novels. I don't think that's really interesting to an audience. But I also don't think it's realistic to expect that AI will not be used in the production of novels. I think it's just too good at generating text that's at least like sort of good to not be used in like any profitable way. And so, what I was proposing as a pretty likely outcome for the future of novels is you basically have some famous author who will maybe like punch in some very basic parameters about their world. Like, how does the magic system work? What's the plot going to be? What's the central conflict? Who are the characters? And then they're going to create a bunch of nodes of the story basically that are sakuga scenes. So scenes that they like actually write. Maybe like the climactic moment of a battle or some like really important emotional moment between two characters. And these are the reference points that everyone who reads the author's novels are going to be able to read and refer to. But then in between all of those, you have these connecting threads that are like AI generated. And these connecting threads are not going to be a limitation, like if you just had them be generic connecting threads or just be a worse novel. The selling point is that they're actually going to change based on the user's algorithmic preferences. So like maybe the person reading this fantasy novel, you can kind of tell they're based on their past consumption, they're not going to like this particular character as much, whereas they really like to hear from this character. Then what might happen is that the connective AI generated frames will adjust so that like they'll hear more of that second character's story and less of the first one. The same events are still going to happen, but it's just going to be presented in like a different way, designed to be the most narratively compelling to the reader. And so you're still going to have these common sakuga writing frames to refer to, but the overall experience is just going to be a lot more curated and personalized. And it's also just going to be a lot easier for authors to generate like mountains and mountains of content because like that's what people want, right? People are always having a big shortage of content. It's kind of hard to write novels quickly. And so, especially if you can kind of get the non-sakuga stuff to be tuned to the reader in like other more subtle ways, I feel like you could actually start to see this sort of thing like starting to compete with TV in a more serious way. I think that it's a lot more common to have TV on like multitasking, right? Like you just have some TV show on in the background. But if you're comparing those, I feel like a sort of like audiobook that has like these sakuga threads connecting by these more skippable things that are still like designed to be maximally engaging to you. That's like a real TV competitor. And I think it would be really interesting if you started to see that emerge. Anyway, I don't really have a direct question about this, but did you have any thoughts about that?
I think it's a good hypothesis. I think it makes some sense that it could happen. I don't know about the outcompeting TV thing, as I feel like we can't really assume TV is going to be static either, and next gen TV might be kind of OP as well.
Well, I guess more what I'm saying is that you could actually imagine reading as a competitor to TV in this universe, whereas like now I feel like you can't really. They don't really occupy the same space in like popular culture.
Yeah, in popular culture for sure. They do for me. And I kind of think they.
Well, but that's what I mean. Like, if it was like that, then it would be more similar to how you engage with it.
Yeah,
Like,
I think that's true. Yeah, in terms of the sakuga, I think it makes sense. I don't know whether this will end up being an advantage or a disadvantage, but I think it would like really change the landscape of talking about books. I think there's something sort of compelling about just like you all getting this slightly different experience. I think there's like I'm forgetting what the movie was, but I think there's been like one or two movies where it's just like where it's like there were slightly different screenings of it. Oh, is that Spider-Verse where it had like the slightly different screenings? Yeah. And this is always just like a really cool Easter egg and stuff. But just like in general, having like different versions of a thing with like all the same main beats happening, I feel like is really conducive to discussion about something. It could be fun to like read a book, talk to someone who also read this book. You like different things in books, and then you get to learn the secret gossip about blah 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 character that like you didn't get in your edition of the novel, but is like all the canon stuff that happened.
I think one thing that could be really cool is you could like send your version to your friend. It's the only version that exists. Maybe like one person's version could even go like viral or something for like especially cooking in this particular way. I feel like it would allow you to take more ownership of your reading.
Yeah. I feel like it would be kind of sad, but it also feels like possible that you would end up with this sort of like celebrity culture where people didn't actually read their own version. They just like read their like, favorite celebrities version or whatever.
Yeah, I mean, interestingly, yeah, there would be the Brandon Sanderson version of The Way of King. Or maybe like authors become more famous for like their versions of like LLM books in general just being more OP because like their taste is better. Like you have Kazuo Ishiguro's version of The Way of Kings. It's like really cooking.
I think one difficulty potentially might be is the transition point. I think you really don't want it to be too noticeable, and that to some extent like kind of limits the scope of...
I could disagree. I think you do want it to be noticeable because I think you want to know like what actually can be discussed with other readers.
Okay.
Like, and
so
I think
you want
know,
like a clear like style.
You want to know that the sakuga part is starting also because you want to like lock in and like really read it. So I was also imagining you could like tune branches a little bit if you're unsatisfied. Just like, oh, I actually want to be like this, and so like the section between these two sakuga nodes just like flips in your edition.
How do you think this like actually comes to happen? Like what do you think the evolution to get here is?
I think that the main limitation is just the algorithm. I think that if you wanted to, like, obviously, I think it's first going to start out by authors just making sakuga fiction. I think that the first step that's going to happen is some author is probably going to like make a really, really long novel that's like pretty good. And the reason they're able to get it really long and maintain quality is because they use this technique. And it's probably not going to be cooking at all compared to future sakuga works that exist just because of the limitations of LLM technology. But I think that there's going to at least have to be like a sort of famous author either making it off of the back of these books, or probably a faster way would just be like an actually famous author embracing this technology, and they would probably just get shit on by like the entire author community. But I don't think it's crazy to imagine someone taking this leap. Yeah, I think it would be a slow takeoff because I think you're really limited by the strength of these algorithms in terms of like actually being able to tune the different nodes to like people's preferences. And I think that that's also going to be difficult because you're going to be limited by the amount of reading data that you have on other people. So like I think that the initial data collection, that sort of feels like the biggest roadblock. Like how do you know such granular information about what people are reading? Someone would really need to cook with like a platform. It would probably kind of Asia, I think. Like you'd probably have some division of like Kakao or like Naver like coming out with their like webtoon thing that like mines all this data about people's reading preferences, and then that kind of forms a base that can be exported. But I think it'd be a pretty slow takeoff.
Yeah, I feel like it would have to come more from a company than an author, I guess, sort of.
Yeah. I mean, I think
That cartoon comparison seems apt.
Yeah, like I would like specifically have to come out of South Korea, I think. Navarre and Cacao just dwarf other reading markets, I think. Just like in general, like so many people read this shit. Like I don't think in like raw numbers, but in terms of like people who are the target audience for this sort of reading.
Yeah, I guess like generating data is sort of just tough in the sense of like people don't read like that many books. Yeah.
I think the actual like technology for generating it is not going to be that hard, especially because people read all kinds of garbage on the internet. I feel like even Sakuga now, if you're just like some like sort of popular webtoon author, just like I feel like there are definitely some authors like that who could maybe get away with it. Just like phone it in for a chapter and feed in a bunch of their writing and then just have it generate like the middle of the chapter. Would anyone really notice? I mean, maybe like if they were popular enough, but I feel like if they were just kind of some like mid-tier webtoon author who was not like that famous, it would just kind of like go under the radar if they did it in a smart way. Like I really still don't think people are that attuned to AI writing.
Yeah. Oh yeah. I mean, I kind of think this would like honestly happen as more of like a thing where it like gets out as like some scandal, like author used AI for this book that was like popular and well liked, and it just like, but like that no one's really doing it that much. Like, fucking forgetting the word. Opposite of opaquely, transparently. Oh my god.
We're leaving that in.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know. I think it feels like a plausible reality. I think I'm convincing myself of the feasibility of this idea. We could make a really hated startup.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it sounds like it's probably going to have a pretty dystopian vibe, but it like doesn't necessarily have to. I feel like.
I think it's going to be hated regardless.
Oh, it'll be hated regardless, I think. But I think if it is like pretty author controlled and stuff, I think it could be pretty cool and like not feel bad. But if the really like bad outcome is if it's just like, you know, really kind of like people are just like stealing authors' books and creating the Sakuga versions of them that are way more popular than the original book.
Yeah, but I feel like in the future you won't be able to succeed as a lot of fantasy authors are succeeding now. Like you would have to succeed on the strength of your Sakuga because that's what the AI wouldn't be able to replicate. So I think you're going to run into that problem regardless of whether this particular model takes off or not. Like you will have to differentiate yourself from the bots. And I feel like this is sort of a good middle ground because you can advertise your product as like, oh, my product is like 40% Sakuga or something like that. I think that it's cringe to say that we should never use AI for creative stuff. But I also think it's cringe to say that saying that is cringe. You can't just be like, oh, like anyone who says that there's some inherent value in this is silly. Like it's something you can be proud of, I guess, like not using AI. You know, I think there are some like brain rotted AI fanatics who are just like, oh yeah, it's like stupid to be proud of this thing being not AI. But I think you should be able to advertise your product as not AI, and I think this provides like a cool ecosystem to do that, and it also allows artists to like continue to compete. To me, it feels like a more artist-centered way to go about doing things. The reality is that artists are kind of cooked already in like a lot of ways, and this would kind of be a way to like limit the damage.
I do kind of feel like Brandon Sanderson, or at least like the Stormlight Archive books, particularly the later ones, do kind of have this vibe where it's just like, yeah, there are a few scenes that you can tell just like really got so much more effort, you know, and attention than the rest of the book. It's also even more so compelled by the fact that I think like the Sakuga parts are actually like kind of the easiest thing to write in some sense. They're both the most important, but also sort of the easiest, I feel like, in terms of them being high quality. Yeah, it's like what made you want to. Yeah, exactly. So it's like, you know, like maybe it'll take some time in terms of getting it like just right what the vision is in your mind's eye, but it's like people aren't really having like writer's block in terms of like the climactic scene they like created the world for. They're having writer's block in terms of just like random conversation that you need to advance the plot in this point.
It could be utopian. Like authors could just spend more time writing the stuff that they want to write and just have more books as a result of doing this, and like have books that are more liked by more people. I guess My thing is that I feel like people probably don't care enough about taste for this outcome to arise. I honestly think that like slop would kind of rise to the top.
Hmm.
If this were to happen in reality, a lot of time it might just be like, oh yeah, the Sakuga section is just like way worse than an AI. It's like all the human parts.
Yeah, but like it might have like I don't know. I think it could also have like a sort of like altruistic bent, you know? It's just
Well,
like
yeah, but I think that's kind
you're
of
like
more how it would be. Like, I
yeah,
think
you're
it
like
would be
reading through the human parts. Like this is the work you have to do as a good member of society to enjoy the the AI parts.
maybe if there was like more of like a Sakuga focused writing climate, people would just get better at writing that specific shit. Because that's like the only shit that matters. We were going today to talk about an article that's out in the magazine now, which is Gordon's first article published to Synthesized Sunsets. So I would definitely recommend that you all check it out. But it is about the web novel The Flower That Bloomed Nowhere, which is something that we are both very fond of. So, Gordon, could you tell us a little bit about the article?
Yeah, so I wanted to write this article. First of all, it's like very on theme in terms of purgatory. But this book, The Flower That Blew Nowhere, both like it quite a bit, and it's just like a very unique, pretty strange book that I came across a few years ago. And I kind of wanted to just write a sort of puff piece for it, recommend it to some people who probably haven't seen it before. And in particular, kind of the angle I go at in the article is that I feel like fantasy in general sort of treats dialogue and conversations as kind of like something to pass through onto like your main events. Like sort of like what you were saying with the Sakuga things. I think it's easy to imagine fantasy going this direction because like in some ways it's already kind of written in that style for the most part, where just like the minor events of the plot, characters talking and whatnot, all have like a very clear purpose to like lead to the main things that matter, which is just like your big action events and like the world building and stuff. As a result, conversations and whatnot are sort of just like an afterthought and don't feel super like realistic. There's a lot of stuff that feels kind of contrived and just like these two people are like talking, but you know, it's pretty clear it's like the author like telling you this thing because you as the reader, it's important to know this thing to like understand this thing that's going to happen in the plot in 10 pages. I don't think this is really true of all books. I think this is true maybe in genre fiction as a whole in general, but like especially in fantasy. But in a lot of like more literary fiction type books or like classic books and whatnot, I feel like conversations are much more of like you have this character, you imagine this character who exists, this other character who exists, and like what would they talk about if they coincided? But in a fantasy novel, you get a lot of new opportunities in terms of what you can have your characters talk about than in a normal novel because you've created a whole new world for them. And I think what The Flower That Blew Nowhere does that's really compelling is they spend all this time building out this really complex world and having this like very complex plot with all your characters existing in it, but then they give them time to breathe and just like talk to each other about topics that are not particularly important to moving the plot forward. And as a result, it's really interesting and you just get a ton of just banger quotes and stuff. Easily the book I've read where it's just like the most things that have been said that I'm like, oh, I had to like write that down because it was just really interesting purely as a quote.
Flower That Bloomed Nowhere kind of appeals to me in that it's like a very spiky book. Like, I think there are some things about The Flower That Bloomed Nowhere that are kind of just like objectively bad. It certainly has like the worst like grammar / punctuation of any book that I've read as a result of it being online somewhere and not being super well edited at that. The pacing of certain sections are just so clearly like off. The pacing of the novel definitely feels serialized in like a bad way. Like it's not just that it's slow moving, but also you can kind of tell the novel is not really like aware of the subsequent parts of it, pacing wise, if that makes sense. But there's other parts that they're just like so good. The dialogue is just second to none, in my opinion, in terms of like it being thought provoking and insightful and cool. And then also like there are just certain characters who are just like so awesome and interesting. Like honestly, I think there's a lot of parts of The Flower That Bloom Nowhere that inform how I think about contemporary issues. I think it's like dialed into like the political realities of the modern world and class struggle and stuff in a very interesting way. The central socio-political conflict in The Flower That Bloomed Nowhere is basically the conflict between young and old, because since people can live forever, the greatest wealth disparity just occurs between young people and old people, because old people just have so much longer to accumulate wealth. People are already wealthier as older people when they're like 60. Imagine if people were like 600. And so the main political division is based on how old you are, and there are interesting ideological differences that arise as a result of this that are also weirdly applicable to a lot of the conflicts that are present in the world today. I would say that probably my favorite quote from The Fire That Blew Nowhere is this quote from a character I really like, Neffy, and it's a conversation with her and the main character, and they're basically talking about some atrocity. The quote is, "Well, I don't know about that," I said, frowning somewhat. "He was going pretty far to defend the Grand Alliance, killing so many people when they put down the riots. I've never seen Bardia be," I hesitated before saying the word, but it came out anyway, "callous in that way about innocent human lives." Sadly, innocent might be the key word there. "It is a complicated thing to grow old," she said. "The blessing of the young is to see the world with fresh eyes, to know injustice instinctively, just as one recoils from disease or rotten meat, and to fight it, clear of head and heart." Her expression grew distant. "But as the years pass, you realize that to meaningfully combat those injustices, you must also fight for things, people, institutions, concepts. And as you do, you pour more and more of yourself into them until, without even truly realizing it's happened, they have replaced that clarity within your heart. And what guides you is no longer instinct, but faith, love for the merely specific." There's a lot going on in that quote, but I feel like it does a pretty good job of outlining some of the tension that's present in like the current conflict. Like I think you have a lot of tension between people who are just like, we need to preserve institutions and kind of like do a sort of bad thing for the sake of the greater good, and like you'll understand when you're older and like wiser, basically. Whereas you have the other people that are just like, no, you're doing this bad thing and you need to like stop doing this bad thing because it's bad. And Lorena's kind of saying they're like both sort of wrong. They're both wrong in their own ways, and it's sort of like the generational gap is sort of what creates that wrongness, and it's sort of like almost an intractable problem. And yeah, this is a quote that I think about a lot. I don't know if you feel the same way.
Yeah, that's a really good quote. There's just like a lot of quotes that are, if maybe not of that amount of quality, there are just like an impressive amount of quotes that are like that amount of like trying to cook really hard. Like that is like quite common, which is sometimes a bit bizarre reading if it just like really doesn't hit. But for the most part, I think it's just really cool and is stylistically really interesting. But yeah, I think the sort of young versus old conflict, it doesn't feel particularly preachy or something in terms of like directly, it might if you were like directly speaking about some sort of political issue today, but simultaneously feels pretty relevant. But it's not like anything happening in the world is like all that similar to anything happening in the real world, right?
Introducing this more salient axis of age is a really good way to kind of like disengage it from the conflicts that are currently in our world, right? Because like you don't really have young and old polarization that much in today's world versus other things. And so I think it kind of allows you to like comment more directly on things without airing some kind of obvious bias.
Yeah, for sure.
Like I'm really not sure where Lorena falls ideologically at all.
Yeah, which I think is cool. I mean, there's some times where I'm like, okay, this is like a take that she has probably, but it's like the take will be something like that thing you just said, where it's just like, is it really a take? Like maybe that's just a thought. Yeah, I think the book I read that, which I mentioned in the article, where the characters sort of felt similarly alive, and there were quotes that were just like, whoa, that's a quote, was like Middlemarch, which I feel like almost considered kind of like the best book, just period. You just have these super memorable characters who are just like not memorable at all in terms of their actions. Like, I don't know, I read Middlemarch like a year and a half ago or so. I just like do not remember many plot events, but just like remember character temperaments and like style of speaking and cadence and stuff very well, which I feel like is not something I can really say about any other book. This book, I mean, is a bit different in the sense of the main character the book is very shaped from their perspective, and they are pretty, they got a lot of stuff going on. They are mentally unwell, we shall say. They're at times not doing so hot. And it's pretty interesting to just like have some innocuous social interaction, but like you're getting it through this just like ridiculously over the top neurotic like commentary of it. I feel like a good way to describe the main character is that they're just sort of like an anti-hero, kind of like not a particularly good person, but she just has like such a ridiculously high amount of self-loathing that as the reader you just sort of forget that she's like actually sort of bad in some ways, because it's just like the amount in which she hates herself is like so high in comparison to the amount she is bad. It's just like like she's actually a good person, but then you're like, oh wait a second. I don't know if you feel that, but I definitely felt that a lot while reading it.
Yeah. I mean, I think she was kind of just like a pretty average person put into like bad circumstances, just kind of morally unremarkable. But yeah, really kind of, I don't want to spoil too much.
I think she did some bad things. I feel like you can kind of get like unlucky in the sense of at each given step in your life, you can like not do something remarkably bad, but just like things can arise such that you like become a bad person at the end of it. And it can sort of just be like an unlucky thing that happened to people, but it's like, it doesn't mean you're like not a bad person, I guess.
A pretty good work to bring up here is Science Fiction of Mrs. Brown, which is this Ursula K. Le Guin essay. People talk about there being an XKCD for everything. I wonder if there's just like Ursula K. Le Guin essay for everything. But basically in this essay, she talks about how there's this Virginia Woolf essay where Virginia Woolf describes this person named Mrs. Brown, who's just a person across from the narrator in a carriage. And Mrs. Brown doesn't do shit. Like, she kind of just is in the carriage. But in this essay, Virginia Woolf is able to write about this character, despite the fact that nothing happens, in a way that's just very evocative and memorable. And you'll remember Mrs. Brown a lot better than you'll remember characters in other works that actually did something. And so Ursula K. Le Guin uses this to make the point, at least when she was writing, science fiction doesn't really have Mrs. Browns. And she said, a good litmus test for science fiction novels is like, think about some sci-fi novel that you read like a couple years ago that was like really cooking with the ideas or whatever, and try to see how many characters you can remember and like specifically like their names and how much you can attach that to like a recognizable personality. And it's like, I bet for most things you can't really think of much. And she was just like, and that's kind of the problem with science fiction here. Now, I would say this is a lot less relevant to today's sci-fi landscape, which is a lot more literary, but she was making a similar point. Most science fiction in particular, and probably also fantasy, it's like characters are more used as like a means for advancing the story and the ideas, as opposed to like interesting subjects unto themselves. And that was something that she really wanted to push back against.
Have you gotten to the part of the flower that bloomed nowhere where the perspective shift, where there's a perspective shift?
Yeah, it's from some other person's POV.
Okay, yeah. So basically, like the whole book's from, the main character's perspective, Utsu. And like eventually, yeah, there's just like this one chapter that's from another person's perspective, but it's just like not said or anything. It just kind of like starts, and things start happening. But it's just like, at least for me, before even any noticeable event happened, just from like the protagonist's thoughts about a few things, I was like pretty much immediately able to tell not only that it was not from the main character's perspective, but like whose perspective it was from. And I thought that was just really cool. And yeah, the characters just have such distinct and recognizable personalities.
Obviously, part of why The Flower That Blew Nowhere is like this, which can't be overstated, is that it is really fucking long. I think that it's not really like longer per se than like Wheel Time or something like that, but it is longer in terms of like sections of book where nothing has to happen, I guess.
Yeah.
As a result of it being online, there's a lot more editorial freedom to kind of have stuff just not happen. It exposes some of the strengths of online writing, is you actually have the freedom to do that. It's not just that previous fantasy authors didn't think to do that, but it's also just like they really couldn't.
This book is so unpublishable. It's so unpublishable. Like, holy shit.
I do think it would be reasonably publishable as like a visual novel or video game type.
Well, it is getting turned into a visual novel, actually.
Oh, it is. Okay. That'd be cool if it became a really popular visual novel.
Yeah, although I still think the visual novel version has like would have a lot of the same like the the maximally, like, the target audience is still just like not all that many people. But I think it could become like a kind of like cult classic, like, you know, really well liked among not all that many people.
Oh, yeah.
And even the book itself, like when I first found this book, it just felt like a bizarre thing, like an anomaly in the world. Like, you know, I start reading this book and it's just like, it's just crazy. And it's just when I started reading it, it was like not popular at all. Even now it's not super popular, but like she had like a Patreon with like 12 subscribers. I don't know, it's just like a similar size like undertaking to this Substack and podcast type of thing. Well, little self-roast there. But yeah, I mean, it's not like literally no one was reading, but it was like, you know, maybe around 100 readers, like max. And it was just kind of like, for this size of audience, it's just like crazy how many ideas are here that I've like never seen before and whatnot. And since then, it has gotten just like, you know, a lot more popular. It's like reasonably successful now. And, you know, it's like something that can like at least like sort of support the author and whatnot. So it's nice to see. One thing I want to say about this is like I don't even really think this is like a direction like fantasy as a genre like should go in general. I think The Way of Kings, for example, is just should be a more popular book than The Flower That Bloomed Nowhere. It just like will appeal to more people, and it probably should. It's right for that to be more like the archetypical fantasy novel. But I do feel like people should try and cook in this direction a lot more. Like to have people kind of like living and breathing in a world, like develop a world and then just have people talking in and stuff. Even just from playing D&D or something, it's always like the classic, you know, thing that like most people's enjoyment of playing D&D is doing some just like random off script like for fun shenanigans rather than like the main plot of what's going to happen. And I feel like just having characters and whatnot actually like exist and breathe and talk with each other in a different world rather than just railroaded through some epic plot line is pretty cool. And specifically having it in this way where it's just like you're really trying to flex with the ideas and stuff.
All right, well, I think this is a pretty good time to wrap things up. As a final note, do you have any short stories that you would like to recommend?
This is, I guess, more of a novella than a short story, but yeah, a bit ago, I read like Murakami's first piece of writing, which was called "Hear the Wind Sing," and it's just kind of this novella that takes place in this like, you know, college-age dude on summer break in Japan, just going to a bar and getting drunk a lot, and sort of nothing happens, and it just has really, really good conversations. And it, other than The Flower That Bloomed Nowhere, is like my favorite conversations in a book. So if you're looking for that type of thing, this book was fantastic and would highly recommend.
All right, well, that is all, and we will see you all next season.